Some betrayals are not written in ink, but carved into the trust between brothers. It begins with a summons from Mycroft Holmes himself, a man who rarely stirs from the silence of the Diogenes Club, and leads to a cipher that hides treachery at the heart of Whitehall. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us follow Holmes into the fog, where loyalty falters and shadows speak of secrets too perilous to ignore. It was upon a grey and windless morning in the early spring that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The fire burned low upon the hearth, sending occasional spurts of flame up the chimney, while Holmes sat in his armchair, his long legs stretched before him, his eyes half closed in an attitude of languid reflection. The daily papers lay in disordered heaps about his chair, some marked with blue pencil, where an item had momentarily attracted his attention. I had occupied myself with a medical journal, and the silence, broken only by the crackle of the coal and the rattle of distant hansom cabs, seemed of that peculiar tranquillity which belongs to the quiet intervals of our singular life together. It was the kind of hour which, by its very calmness, gave no hint of the approaching disturbance destined to shake it so rudely. The sudden clang of the doorbell startled us both, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a sealed envelope, its edges still damp from the mist without. The superscription caught Holmes's eye at once, for he rose with a swiftness that belied his earlier languor. I too leaned forward, for upon the heavy cream-coloured paper was the unmistakable hand of Mycroft Holmes. The signature alone would have lent it weight, but the very manner of delivery, so abrupt, so urgent, spoke of matters beyond the ordinary. Holmes tore it open with a sharp movement, and I saw his keen grey eyes narrow as they ran swiftly across the brief contents. His brows drew together, quickened interest of his mind. Yet I, who knew him well, could detect beneath the outward coolness a suppressed energy, a tightening of thought which foretold action. As Holmes fell into silence, his long fingers steepled before him, my own reflections grew darker. Mycroft Holmes, as I had known him, was a man of such extraordinary indolence that the notion of his personally summoning his brother suggested nothing less than a national crisis. The elder Holmes was content to remain in his Diogenes Club armchair, his corpulent figure immovable, save when the great machinery of government required his intellect. If such a man, whose very genius lay in stillness, had now bestirred himself to send an urgent missive, what calamity might threaten England? Was it foreign intrigue, a threatened breach of treaty, or some hidden peril gnawing at the vitals of the state? My mind, fertile in apprehensions, moved from one to another, and I found myself staring into the fire with an apprehension I could not wholly dismiss. Holmes rose at last, and seized his coat with a briskness that admitted no delay. "Come, Watson," said he. "The matter brooks no loitering." A few minutes later, we were rattling through the damp streets in a hansom cab. London lay under a pall of fog, its lamps blurred halos of light, its pavements slick with the fine drizzle that crept into one's very bones. I could not but feel, as we passed silent warehouses and shuttered shops, that the city itself seemed to conspire in secrecy. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his profile thrown into sharp relief by the dim lamplight, his eyes fixed upon some inward calculation. I ventured no remark, for the gravity of his expression forbade intrusion. Yet in my breast the unease had deepened into a sense of foreboding, as though the very air were laden with unspoken menace. The cab drew up at last before the portico of the Diogenes Club, that most peculiar of institutions where silence is golden and intrusion is a cardinal sin. Yet even within those sacred walls, the unusual was apparent. The porter, ordinarily a man of imperturbable stolidity, greeted us with a gravity touched by unease. A whispered word, a furtive glance along the corridor, all bespoke some weighty matter troubling the composure of the place. As we ascended the wide staircase, The hush seemed deeper than ever, as if the very carpets conspired to stifle sound. My own heart beat faster, and I felt with every step that we drew nearer to some revelation of exceptional consequence. At the end of the passage, in a private chamber whose door stood slightly ajar, we beheld the figure of Mycroft Holmes. He sat, not in his customary posture of ease, but bent forward in his chair, his fleshy hands clasped tightly together, his countenance unusually pale. At the sight of us he raised his head, and in his eyes there glimmered an anxiety I had never before associated with that massive intellect. It needed no words to tell me that behind those heavy brows there lurked a secret whose gravity would soon draw both Holmes and myself into its shadow. Scarcely had Holmes closed the door upon the heavy presence of his elder brother than there came a timid knock upon our own sitting room in Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose pallor was more eloquent than words, and whose hands, twitching ceaselessly at the brim of his hat, betrayed a nervous agitation bordering on collapse. His thin lips quivered, his eyes darted from corner to corner, as though each shadow might conceal some pursuer. I confess that I have seldom seen a creature more utterly undone by terror, and the contrast between his broken figure and Holmes's lean calmness struck me forcibly. It was evident that the errand which brought him had already exacted a heavy toll upon his courage, and yet some desperateness.
The vault. The heavy oak door was fitted with an inner bolt, while the single narrow casement was fastened by bars of iron. "I swear to you, gentlemen," he cried, his voice rising to a note of despair, "no mortal creature could have entered or quitted while I stood in the corridor, and yet he was gone from life as surely as if the hand of an assassin had struck him down." He wrung his hands in a frenzy of remembrance, as though the very walls of our chamber might close in upon him with the same inescapable mystery. Holmes leaned forward at this point, his gaze keen as a rapier. The clerk's voice dropped to a whisper. "Upon the desk lay a document, sir. One of those infernal ciphers with which the Foreign Office is ever plagued. It was half decoded, the figures giving way to plain words, but the pen had trailed off, as though the hand that held it had been struck in the midst of labour. A blot of ink spread across the margin, and the sheet itself bore marks as though a page had been torn hastily from the Book of Keys. I know not what it meant, but to my eye it was the last act of my poor master's life, arrested by sudden death." His words carried a chill that seemed to creep about the room, for one could not but picture the lonely scholar bent above his task, surprised in the very instant of revelation. Yet, even as his tale deepened, the visitor faltered, and a new note crept into his account. "I must confess," said he with evident reluctance, "that Mr. Willett was not a man of robust mind. There were times when he muttered to himself, and twice I saw him start as though at some phantom no other could perceive. More than once he spoke of strange noises in the passages, or of a hand that sought to guide his pen. Some called it mere nerves, others whispered darker things, but—" He broke off, burying his face in his hands. It was plain that the suggestion of a disordered intellect had been advanced by others, and that he half feared we might seize upon it as a ready explanation. I could not but feel the weight of this ambiguity, for suicide or madness might indeed cloak the more sinister truth. Holmes, however, displayed none of the impatience which might have silenced a lesser man. His voice, cool and steady, drew from the clerk the smallest particulars: the position of the chair, the angle of the pen, the faint odour of tobacco that lingered though the deceased had never smoked. He asked of the ink, the window latch, the broken fibres of the blotting paper, and each answer he stored away with that inscrutable calm of his, like a banker receiving gold into a vault. I marvelled at the precision of his questioning, for he neither pressed the man beyond his strength, nor allowed him to wander into irrelevancies. Step by step, the impossible chamber took on outline in my imagination.
though the mystery only deepened with every detail. At length the poor fellow fell silent, exhausted by the torrent of his own agitation. Holmes rose and paced slowly to the window, his hands behind his back, his head sunk upon his chest. Then, turning, he said in his quietest tone, "You need not reproach yourself, sir. Your fears are not without foundation. The death of your colleague is not the work of disordered fancy. There are forces here, subtle and perilous."
The chamber into which we were admitted bore the stillness of a tomb. A tall casement, barred with iron, admitted little light, and the air was close, with that peculiar staleness which lingers when life has been extinguished. The great oak door, which had to be forced on the morning of the tragedy, still showed the marks of violence upon its panels. My imagination readily supplied the scene. The pale figure slumped at the desk, the ink-stained fingers, the startled eyes that no longer saw. Even in its present emptiness, the room retained a certain oppression, as though the spectre of the dead man yet lingered among his papers. I confess that a chill passed through me. The seldom had I encountered a place so steeped in the intangible essence of death, and seldom had I so keenly felt the futility of human defences against the stealth of the assassin's hand. Holmes had been silent since our entry, but his movements betrayed a restless precision. He bent low over the desk where the fatal labour had been arrested. With his lens, he examined the surface, then with a swift gesture, drew my attention to a faint scattering of grey particles. "Ash, Watson," he murmured, "but not of the variety with which I am familiar from Mr. Willett's habits." He was no smoker. Indeed, his lungs would scarcely have tolerated it. Yet here we find the traces of a strong, dark shag, Turkish perhaps. The incongruity struck me at once. In this sealed chamber, where no visitor could have entered, the presence of foreign tobacco spoke as loudly as the cry of a witness. Holmes said no more, but I could see in the narrowing of his eyes that this tiny fragment had already become a cornerstone in the structure of his deductions. From the desk, Holmes's gaze travelled to a chair drawn slightly askew. He placed his hand upon it, and it wobbled at the touch. Kneeling, he revealed that one of its legs had been splintered recently, the wood fresh and raw at the break. "Consider, Watson," he whispered. "The man who dies quietly at his work leaves no such tokens. This points to sudden disturbance, to struggle perhaps, though confined, and quickly quelled." I could picture, with a shudder, the unseen intruder forcing the unfortunate clerk back into his seat, the legs snapping under the weight of the contest. Yet how, in a room so perfectly sealed, could such an encounter have occurred? The contradiction gnawed at me, and I felt myself adrift in a labyrinth where every passage turned upon itself and mocked the reason of the mind. Holmes next took up the ledger and cipher book that lay upon the desk. The clerk's work, half completed, sprawled across the page in uneven characters, a blot of ink spreading like a dark wound at the margin. Holmes's brow furrowed as he turned the leaves with quick, sensitive fingers. "Note here, Watson," said he, "the abrupt break, the pen trailing into nothingness. And here, observe the torn edge where a sheet has been deliberately removed." He held up the mutilated page. The missing fragment, not the cipher itself, was the object of this intrusion. What truth it concealed we may yet discover, but be assured it was knowledge worth killing for. His words, delivered in that level tone I knew so well, carried a chill weight. The silence of the room pressed in, as though the dead man himself demanded we pursue the secret for which he had given his life. For my own part, I found the matter increasingly difficult to reconcile with the whispers of suicide and failing nerves that had already circulated through the office. The broken chair, the foreign ash, the missing page, each pointed with him not triumph but a burden. It was plain that some dark inference had already taken root in his thoughts, and though it reassured me to know that his intellect was at work, it unsettled me to see him so grave. The case had begun to stir in him a seriousness rarely shown, and I could not escape the conviction that we were embarked upon a matter of national peril. The Diogenes Club had ever seemed to me the most singular of institutions, but upon that evening, its peculiar stillness struck me with an intensity bordering upon dread. The wide hall, usually so devoid of human animation, held a strange undercurrent of unease. Even the porters, whose stolid impassivity rivaled that of waxen figures, betrayed a furtive gravity in their movements. A glance exchanged in silence, a cough stifled before its time, seemed to echo more than common sound in those echoing corridors. As we were conducted upward by a servant, whose tread fell as cautiously as though we intruded upon some sacred chamber, I could not escape the conviction that the very hush of the place had been deepened by the shadow of the event that drew us thither. I saw Holmes's eyes glimmer with interest, though his countenance preserved its habitual composure. We were ushered into a private room, where Mycroft Holmes awaited us. The change in him was startling, for the great man who habitually bore the imperturbability of a sphinx now presented an aspect that bordered upon agitation. His complexion, ordinarily florid, had assumed a pallor that made his heavy features more pronounced, while his massive hands shifted restlessly upon the arms of his chair. He greeted us without rising, yet his eyes darted from brother to brother with an energy that belied his customary languor. I could not but marvel at the sight, for it was my first occasion to see the elder Holmes discomposed, and I knew instinctively that the cause must be of no trifling order. In that moment, I comprehended that our summons— It was Holmes who broke the tension with a dry observation. "You sent for me, Mycroft. I presume you will condescend to explain." At this, Mycroft gave a slow sigh, his great frame sinking lower as though the burden upon him were physical. "The man who died," said he, "was no ordinary clerk, but one entrusted with the transcription of certain negotiations of the utmost delicacy. His task was to reduce into cipher the exchanges between ourselves and a foreign power. The security of the kingdom rested, in part, upon his vigilance." His voice, though steady, betrayed a note of reluctance, as though each admission were dragged unwilling from his lips. His death, in such circumstances, is no mere private misfortune. It is an event that threatens to disturb the balance of Europe itself. These words, delivered with grave precision, seemed to darken the chamber with the weight of their implication. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "And the missing sheet of cipher?" he asked. Mycroft's hand closed upon the arm of his chair until the knuckles blanched. "If that page has passed beyond our control," he said slowly, "the consequence is incalculable. These words deleted is a weight of no. Should it foreign hands, not only would their lives be forfeit, but the very edifice of our alliances might crumble. One indiscreet disclosure, and years of negotiation are undone." I confess that a chill ran through me as I grasped the magnitude of this peril. Holmes, however, appeared less daunted than intrigued. He tapped the fingers of one hand lightly against the table, as if the very gravity of the situation were but a spur to his restless curiosity. Mycroft's eyes met his brother's with sudden firmness. "This is not your affair, Sherlock," he said, the words carrying the weight of authority. "The security of the state rests upon channels beyond the ken of a consulting detective. You may amuse yourself with private—" A door left ajar. It is my duty, both as a logician and as a citizen, to walk through it." There was no anger in his words, but rather a measured irony that rendered them the more immovable. I could see the flush mount to Mycroft's cheeks, though he made no rejoinder. It was as though two mighty engines had touched buffers, silent, yet irresistible. As I sat between them, I felt a strange awe at the spectacle of two such minds arrayed in quiet conflict. One represented the vast machinery of government, cautious and secretive, fearful of disturbance. The other, a restless spirit, intolerant of contradiction, compelled by logic to pursue truth wherever it might lead. Their silence pressed upon me with a weight almost unbearable, and I foresaw that the path Holmes had chosen would bring us not only into peril, but into opposition with forces more formidable than any criminal adversary. The lamps burned low, and the hush of the Diogenes Club deepened around us, until it seemed that all the shadows of London had gathered in that room to listen to the discord of two brothers. It was upon the morrow of our encounter at the Diogenes that Holmes first drew my attention to a rumour circulating among the junior clerks of Whitehall. A woman, veiled and clad in sombre black, had been observed loitering near the Foreign Office on several successive evenings, her figure seen at hours when honest folk were abed. The tale, vague yet insistent, reached us through a witness whose account Holmes weighed with his customary care. "A shadow that returns with regularity, Watson, ceases to be mere chance," he observed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Whether grief or guilt be her companion, we must learn what draws her steps to so perilous a quarter." There was in his tone that quiet relish which betokened the scent of a fresh trail, and I confess that the image of the solitary that very night found us abroad, following at a cautious distance the tall, black-clad figure as it moved through the gaslit labyrinth of Westminster. The fog, clinging in patches, blurred the lamplight into wan halos, and the sound of her footfall upon the stones carried with a strange insistence in the silence. We kept to the shadows, our tread softened by years of practice, yet I felt the curious thrill of the chase coursing through my veins. She paused at intervals, glancing back as though fearful of pursuit, then pressed on with renewed haste. Past shuttered shops and narrow alleys we traced her, the night around us heavy with damp and mystery. To my imagination, every echo in the distance seemed the whisper of a conspiracy, every flicker of light behind curtained windows a signal from some hidden accomplice. Still Holmes pressed forward, his figure bent, his eyes gleaming with purpose. At length our quarry halted before a modest lodging-house in a narrow street off the Strand. She knocked softly, and the door admitted her without question, as though her visits were familiar. Holmes, with his customary assurance, engaged the landlady in quiet conversation, under the pretext of seeking an acquaintance who might once have resided there. The woman, simple of manner and garrulous by nature, volunteered readily that her tenant was a widow of respectable habits, who kept to herself and paid punctually. Holmes's inquiries, though framed with innocent courtesy, probed delicately into the woman's circumstances, her hours of absence, and the tenor of her conversation. I marvelled, as ever, at his ability to elicit information without arousing suspicion, each casual word of the landlady feeding some hidden current of deduction that ran beneath his calm exterior. From these inquiries we learned that the widow had once been wife to a clerk of the Foreign Office, dismissed some years before upon a charge of negligence that had cost him his position. His health, already fragile, had declined, and his early death left her in straitened circumstances. Watson, you will observe that appearances conspire to mislead us into facile conclusions, but truth, like a lantern in the fog, rarely shines where first we expect it. Our widow is innocent, though her steps, unknowingly,
have brushed close to dangerous ground. His words fell with quiet emphasis, and I perceived that, while the shadow of suspicion had been lifted from the woman, the darkness of the larger affair only deepened. We had not gone far along the street when Holmes, with a sudden tightening of his arm upon mine, drew me into the shelter of a doorway. Two figures, ill-clad and slinking, passed slowly upon the opposite pavement, their eyes roving in a manner that betrayed watchfulness rather than chance loitering. "Note them well, Watson," murmured Holmes. "We are not the only hunters abroad. The widow may be but a phantom to us, yet to others she serves as cover or decoy. The wires of espionage run deep, and even the most innocent may tread upon them unawares." His words, carried low, seemed to blend with the drip of water from a gutter and the muffled toll of a distant clock. The night, which but moments before had seemed a scene of pity, now resumed its mantle of menace. When at last we reached Baker Street, Holmes turned to me with a look that mingled irony and gravity. "Our woman in black is no conspirator, Watson, yet she has rendered us a service. By following her shadow, we have glimpsed the true players in this game, and they do not wear mourning." He sank into his chair, his eyes fixed upon the fire with that inward gaze I knew so well. For myself, I felt the sense of peril deepen, as though the darkness we had pursued had revealed not closure, but the outline of some vaster intrigue awaiting us. That evening, the familiar warmth of Baker Street belied the intensity with which Holmes set himself to work. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows upon the walls lined with books and papers. Yet Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the cipher fragments he had spread across the table. With the meticulous patience that I have so often observed, he examined each torn edge, each blot of ink, as if the very fibres of the paper might betray a secret to his scrutiny. My presence was almost incidental. I sat quietly, pen in hand, recording his movements with the careful attention of one accustomed to marvel at the workings of a superior intellect. He murmured occasionally, not in doubt but in logical trial, conjectures laid and dismissed, sequences tested, patterns noted. The city outside was muffled by fog, yet within the flat a tempest of thought seemed to rage, silent yet formidable. The cipher page, long assumed lost, began to yield its secrets under his relentless analysis, each faint impression and irregular stroke accumulating into an intelligible whole. I could not help but marvel at the power of his mind, able to restore what common eyes might consider forever obliterated. By the small hours, Holmes leaned back, his eyes alight with a triumph tempered by caution. "We have it, Watson," he said softly. He spread before me a reconstruction so precise that the missing page appeared as though newly printed. Lines of text, at first indecipherable, revealed themselves as a list. Names interspersed with locations, subtle markers of employment, and, most tellingly, designations in foreign service. The implication was immediate and chilling. Agents embedded within the machinery of London, their loyalties divided, their movements clandestine. Holmes traced each name with a delicate finger, comparing them against memoranda and directories, noting subtle correspondences and incongruities. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how even the innocuous might conceal intelligible in light of this revelation. He had glimpsed the architecture of betrayal, Watson, and the architect feared exposure." Holmes continued. "The murder, previously enigmatic, now appeared a deliberate act to silence an inconvenient witness before he could reveal what he had learned. It was a lesson, chilling yet instructive, in the lethal economy of secrets. Knowledge, when unearthed in the wrong hands, might cost a life. Further examination revealed threads leading far beyond the streets of London. Certain correspondences, recently unearthed and now compared to the ciphered list, suggested the involvement of a diplomat from Vienna, whose recorded movements and private communications
aligned disturbingly with the agents' names. Holmes's eyes, narrowed in calculation, traced patterns in the logs that would escape all but the most keen observation. Note, Watson, the regularity of his visits, the correspondence which is ostensibly innocuous, but contains markers intelligible to the initiated. Our Viennese friend is not ignorant of the cipher's existence, nor indifferent to its contents. It became apparent that an international element had been introduced, complicating what might have been a purely domestic intrigue into a matter of considerable diplomatic consequence. Each connection, seemingly coincidental, wove itself into a net of subtle menace, leaving us with the uneasy impression that the enemy's hand was both precise and well-informed. I confess that the weight of these revelations pressed upon my mind with an unfamiliar heaviness. The notion that agents of foreign power moved unobserved within the heart of our own government, that a simple list could hold such deadly importance, filled me with apprehension. Should Holmes's deductions prove correct, the consequences would be nothing less than a scandal of international magnitude, threatening the delicate fabric of diplomacy with the exposure of traitors and spies alike. I pictured the newspapers aflame with accusation, the corridors of Whitehall in turmoil, and the fate of innocents caught unwittingly amidst the machinations of men.
And yet, as he considered the Vienna connection and the ciphered names, Holmes's habitual caution reasserted itself. "Too neatly arranged, Watson," he murmured, with the faintest hint of irony. "Every line of evidence appears to converge upon the foreign diplomat, yet such precision often signals the hand of a more cunning manipulator. The truth is rarely so accommodating." His skepticism, quietly expressed, reminded me that even the most compelling appearances may conceal artifice, and that the elegance of deduction is matched by the subtlety of deception. Holmes's mind, ever alert to the traps laid by both circumstance and human cunning, refused to accept a tidy narrative when disorder lurked beneath. At last he settled into his chair, staring into the fire with eyes half shrouded in reflection. "We have learned much, Watson, yet the true enemy remains at large. The cipher has shown us not the answer, but the danger. Remember this well." His words, low and deliberate, carried a weight that silenced all other thought. The room seemed to absorb our apprehension, and the distant chimes of the morning bells marked not resolution, but the quiet prelude to a peril whose magnitude we could scarcely gauge. We sat together, the smoke curling above us, knowing that our investigation had unearthed only the first layer of an intricate and dangerous design. It was late when Holmes and I quitted the Foreign Office and took our way along Baker Street toward our own rooms. The air was raw, the fog dense and clinging, and the lamps threw but feeble globes of light that scarcely pierced the gloom. Holmes, his head bent in thought, moved beside me with his customary stride, his silence broken only by the occasional flicker of a phrase relating to the cipher. "Names, Watson," he murmured once. "Names that will not remain hidden. They cry out for exposure." His voice, though low, carried the weight of peril. For my own part, I felt the oppressive stillness of the hour pressing upon my senses, and I welcomed the hunted in our own familiar quarter. The night closed round us more heavily, the fog becoming a living shroud in which unseen enemies moved with calculated patience. We had reached a stretch where the gas lamps were set farther apart, their dim halos scarcely overlapping, when the attack came. From either side of the street, two cloaked figures sprang with startling suddenness, their movements swift and purposeful. One struck me a blow across the shoulder that sent me reeling, while the other made a snatch at Holmes's breast pocket, where he carried the notes and reconstructed cipher. In the same instant, a third figure emerged from the fog, his hand grasping at Holmes with practiced precision. I heard the harsh intake of breath, the scuffle of feet upon wet pavement, and felt the surge of violence crash upon us like a breaking wave. The silence of pursuit gave way to the muffled ferocity of assault, and I found myself struggling in a darkness alive with flailing limbs and whispered curses.
my mind aflame with the thought that they sought the very heart of our investigation. In the midst of the melee, Holmes's voice reached me, clear and commanding, even in the tumult. "To the curb, Watson! Quickly!" he cried, thrusting me aside with a force that saved me. At that instant, a cab, drawn at reckless speed, loomed from the mist, its wheels striking sparks as it swerved toward us. Holmes had glimpsed what I, in my confusion, had not. A peculiar chalk mark upon the wheel spokes, the same mark he had noted earlier in connection with our unseen pursuers. The vehicle, hired for our destruction, bore down with murderous intent, and, but for his warning, I should have been crushed beneath its wheels. As it thundered past, the driver's face, half hidden, betrayed no hesitation, and I realized with a shudder that these were no common footpads, but men under orders, their every movement calculated towards silencing us and seizing the precious paper. The failure of the cab emboldened us. Holmes, with a swiftness that astonished me, struck the nearer assailant a blow that sent him sprawling, while I, recovering my footing, managed to fling off the grip of the second. For a moment the fog was alive with the scramble of feet and the clash of bodies. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack dissolved. Our opponents, realizing their stratagem had failed, melted back into the night, leaving us bruised but unbroken. I leaned against the railings, breathless, my heart pounding with the aftermath of violence. Holmes, however, remained composed, his coat somewhat disordered, his eyes alight, not with fear, but with that peculiar gleam I had seen often in the heat of pursuit. "They did not expect resistance," he said grimly, brushing the dust from his sleeve. "That is instructive." The words, delivered so calmly, only deepened the impression that we had narrowly stepped aside from a most deliberate fate. Upon the ground near where the struggle had occurred lay a small weapon, hastily abandoned in retreat. A short, heavy cosh, worn smooth with use. Holmes stooped, examined it with his lens, and then turned his attention once more to the vanished cab, whose insignia he had marked with an accuracy beyond my comprehension. "This, Watson, is no random assault," he said gravely. "The object was not our purses, nor even our lives, but the cipher fragment in my possession. The care with which the ambush was laid, the precision of its execution, betray an intelligence behind it of no mean order. The hand that directs these men is close to the heart of the matter, and I fear, not far from the councils of power themselves." His words, measured and solemn, struck me with renewed force, for they implied that betrayal lay not in foreign alleys, but within the very walls of our own security. We resumed our walk with wary haste, the fog still clinging about us, though our assailants had fled. Holmes's countenance, in him the old air of massive detachment, his bulk settled into a chair with the calm of a man immovable by circumstance. And yet, beneath the apparent composure, I fancied a certain rigidity about the eyes and mouth, as though the serenity he assumed was strained against some inward tumult. The atmosphere between the brothers promised a collision, and I confess I dreaded the consequences of so rare and perilous a conflict of minds. Holmes wasted no time in preamble. His voice, usually modulated with irony or cool detachment, cut across the stillness with a severity that startled me. "Mycroft," said he, "you have withheld from me a truth which is vital to the matter before us. The shadow we pursue does not fall from Vienna, nor from the continent at all. It springs from your very threshold. The traitor is no distant figure. He moves daily within your own staff." The words, plain and uncompromising, struck like the crack of a whip. Mycroft shifted in his chair, his heavy eyelids lowering, but he did not immediately reply. Holmes pressed on, his long finger raised in emphasis. 3 men could have orchestrated the ambush in Baker Street. Only one of them would have known the hour and place of our return. That knowledge was not carried by any chance eavesdropper in the street, but by one whose access lies within the corridors you command.
At length, Mycroft raised his gaze, and his countenance had assumed the immobile gravity of stone. "You go too far, Sherlock," he said, his tone one of restrained severity. "The men who serve me are men tested and tried, whose loyalty to the crown is above question. To fling suspicion within these walls is to endanger not merely reputations, but the very stability of government. Such an accusation, hurled without proof, is as reckless as it is destructive." His words, spoken with deliberate calm, carried the weight of authority, and for a moment I almost believed that Holmes had indeed pressed beyond warrant. Mycroft's massive hands rested upon the arms of his chair, motionless, yet conveying an impression of formidable power restrained. I could see that the elder brother, accustomed to the vast machinery of state, viewed even suspicion itself as a perilous contagion, to be resisted with all his will. Holmes, however, was unmoved. With an austere precision, he unfolded the steps of his reasoning. He described the cipher fragment, its mutilation, and the vanished page whose contents could only be known to one in the closest proximity to its work. He recalled the attack in Baker Street, where our assailants struck with uncanny timing and employed a cab already marked for their use, details which no foreign emissary could have arranged without intelligence from within. He spoke of the coche, abandoned in haste, of the very method of the ambush, which bore the signature of one trained to precision rather than the blunderings of common hirelings. "Consider, Mycroft," he concluded, "that knowledge of my possession of the cipher fragment existed only among those to whom you confided the matter. To deny that the hand guiding these attacks lies within your circle is to deny the logic of facts themselves." His voice, low but implacable, carried with it a weight I could not resist. For a long moment Mycroft remained silent, his great form sunk in shadow. At last he raised his head, and the mask of denial had fallen from him. "You are not wrong," he said, "whether from affection or from fear of scandal, is to lend strength to the very forces that prey upon us. You may preserve the reputation of a servant, but at what cost? At the cost of the state, at the cost of lives already sacrificed, at the cost of truth itself. You are the custodian of great power. Do not permit that power to shield the guilty while it imperils the innocent." His words, spoken without passion yet with inexorable conviction, rang through the chamber like the tolling of a bell. I saw Mycroft's massive frame sag slightly, as though the inexorable weight of logic had borne down upon him more heavily than any brother's rebuke. I sat silent, scarcely daring to breathe, struck by the rare spectacle of those two prodigious minds locked in combat. One was bound by the intricate chains of duty, sentiment, and statecraft. The other was free, relentless, guided only by the uncompromising pursuit of truth. Between them lay not merely a problem of espionage, but the peril of brotherhood, strained to its utmost. The silence that followed was more dreadful than speech, and I found myself wishing for any sound to break the tension, yet none came. I left that chamber with the conviction that our inquiry had entered a realm darker and more perilous than any murder or theft, for here loyalty, duty, and justice themselves stood in tragic opposition. When we quitted the Diogenes that evening, Holmes walked beside me in silence until we reached the shadow of a quiet square. There he paused, his voice dropping to a low and measured tone. "There is but one way to draw the serpent from its hole, Watson. We must tempt him with the very prize for which he struck." He outlined with characteristic brevity a scheme by which we should re-enter the Foreign Office under cover of night, carrying with us a fragment of the cipher, not the true document, but a facsimile, wrought by Holmes's ingenious hand. The room where Willett had perished would serve as the snare. "If our man is what I believe him to be," Holmes added, "his compulsion will drive him to return, even at the risk of discovery. It is in such compulsions, Watson, that guilt betrays itself." His tone was so calm, so inexorable,
that I felt the inevitability of the plan weigh upon me more heavily than the peril it entailed. The appointed hour found us crouched within the dim recess of the Foreign Office archive, a single lamp extinguished at our side. The stillness of the place was profound, yet every sound of the ancient building seemed magnified to the pitch of menace. The creak of a joist, the faint settling of the timber, the distant chime of a church bell, each fell upon my senses like a signal of approaching doom. My own breath seemed too loud, my heart a hammer in my breast. Holmes sat beside me with the composed stillness of a figure carved in stone, his eyes fixed upon the desk where the decoy cipher lay in readiness. The odour of paper and stale ink hung about the chamber, mingled with the faint metallic tang of the iron bars that sealed the window. Never had I felt so vividly that walls themselves might close in upon us, complicit in the dark secret of the crime we sought to avenge. It was not long past midnight when Holmes's hand, light upon my arm, bade me listen. At first I heard nothing. Then came the faintest crime, bore the outward calm of his station. His lips were set, his brow unruffled, as though this midnight intrusion were but an extension of his official duty. I confess that a shock of pity mingled with horror in my breast, for I had never suspected duplicity beneath that grave exterior. Yet his movements betrayed the truth. With swift precision he moved to the desk, his eyes fastening hungrily upon the cipher fragment which Holmes had so artfully contrived. There was in his every gesture the familiarity of one accustomed to such trespass, and the cold assurance of a man whose betrayal had been long prepared. No sooner had his hand closed upon the paper than Holmes sprang from the shadows, his lean figure interposed between the traitor and escape. Arkwright started back, his composure shattered, and in an instant the chamber erupted into violent struggle. I leapt to Holmes's aid, and together we bore him against the heavy desk. Papers scattered, a chair splintered under the weight of the contest, and the sound of our exertions seemed deafening in that cloistered room. Desperation lent the man strength, but Holmes, with his wiry agility, seized his wrist in a grip like iron, while I pinned his other arm. After a brief but furious struggle, Arkwright collapsed upon the floor, panting and subdued, the false cipher still clutched in his trembling hand. His mask of calm authority had fallen away, leaving only the haunted look of a man cornered by his own treachery. Holmes struck a match and lit the lamp, flooding the chamber with a pale glow that revealed the captive's pallor. Under Holmes's stern and measured questioning, the truth spilled forth in broken tones. Debts, accumulated through reckless speculation, had driven him to desperation. Foreign agents had seized upon his weakness, offering money in exchange for access to secrets his position afforded. At first, he had yielded small concessions, persuaded that no true harm was done. Yet each act drew him deeper, until blackmail and fear bound him tighter than loyalty ever had. "I meant no treason," he gasped, "but the choice was made for me. They would ruin me, disgrace me. I had no path but theirs." His words, though pitiful, carried the unmistakable ring of truth. In the lamplight I beheld not a master conspirator, but a man enslaved by his own folly, undone by the inexorable hand of temptation. Holmes regarded him with a composure that chilled me more than anger would have done. "Loyalty bought by fear," he said quietly, "is loyalty already sold. You were lost, Mr. Arkwright, the moment you permitted the enemy to see the measure of your weakness." His words fell like a sentence, and for a moment the chamber seemed colder than the night beyond its walls. I could not repress a shiver, for I perceived that, in Holmes's eyes, pity was of little avail where betrayal had taken root. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of exposure, and I knew that, though our trap had succeeded, darker reckonings lay yet ahead. We quitted Whitehall in the small hours, the air damp with fog, and silence pressing close upon us. The traitor, under guard, had been led away by officials whose faces betrayed neither pity nor anger, but the cold satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Yet for Holmes and myself there was no exultation in that sombre march. The struggle in the archive, the confessed recrimination escaped him. No gesture of anger or despair broke the mask. Only the stillness of his hands, folded heavily upon his knee, and the pallor that dulled his features, revealed the depth of the wound. His silence, more eloquent than speech, impressed upon me the bitter truth that even the mighty are not secure against the frailties of those they trust. Holmes, ever faithful to logic, recounted the events with a tone stripped of triumph, as though he delivered not victory, but a ledger balanced in cold arithmetic. He spoke of the missing cipher page, of the ash upon the desk, of the broken chair that had hinted at struggle, and of the midnight ambush in Baker Street that betrayed knowledge no outsider could possess. Step by step he retraced the sequence that led from suspicion to certainty, his words precise, his gaze unflinching. To hear him was to witness an equation resolved, each factor falling into place with the inevitability of mathematics. And yet, there was no exultation in his recital. He spoke as though he set down the history of a contagion, the symptoms catalogued, the cause discovered, but the malady itself a stain upon the system which no deduction could erase. Mycroft inclined his head gravely, acknowledging the logic even as it deepened his own affliction. For a long while Mycroft sat immovable, his great frame sunk as though under invisible weight. At last he lifted his eyes, and his voice, though steady, bore the tone of reluctant confession. "You have proved your case, Sherlock," he said. "The facts are irrefutable, yet the cost is one which cannot be measured by reason alone. Loyalty, once broken, leaves a wound that no triumph of detection may heal. I trusted him as I have trusted few men in my life, and he has left me poorer than if he had stolen gold or secrets. He has stolen my faith." The words, spoken without ornament, carried such gravity that I felt a pang of sympathy for the elder brother, whose life, bound as it was to the machinery of state, admitted few attachments. The silence which followed was heavier than debate. Holmes remained seated, his eyes averted from his brother, while Mycroft gazed into the distance, with a look that seemed to see nothing of the present moment. It was a strange and unsettling spectacle, for I had never before beheld Holmes subdued in the hour of success. Between them stretched a gulf, not of anger but of sorrow, one bound by the inexorable laws of logic, the other by the subtler ties of human sentiment. I, an unwilling witness, felt the air of that chamber laden with a gloom deeper than any quarrel. The triumph of intellect had been won, but it was a triumph without joy, a light cast upon treachery that revealed not victory, but desolation. At length Holmes rose, and as we quitted the Diogenes, his words fell in a tone more melancholy than I had ever heard from him. "It is an easy thing to unmask a villain, Watson," said he, "but it is far harder to comfort a brother whose faith has been betrayed." There was no irony in his voice, no sharpness of judgment, only the sombre cadence of truth, uttered from the depths of reflection. It seemed to me that for once Holmes himself felt the inadequacy of pure logic, that the human heart, with its loyalties and affections, could suffer wounds for which reason had no balm. His remark lingered with me long after, more haunting than any of his keenest deductions, for it spoke not of the science of crime, but of the frailty of mankind. Thus ended a case unlike any other in my long association with Sherlock Holmes. The cipher was secured, the traitor unmasked, and yet no sense of victory accompanied the resolution. As we returned to Baker Street, The fog of London seemed but a mirror of the fog that hung about our spirits. Holmes, usually animated in triumph, walked in sombre silence. And I, observing him, felt that even his great intellect had been touched